There is a moment on the final night of Troy when the entire city is happier than it has been in 10 years. The gates stand open. The wine is flowing. Men who have not slept in their own beds since they were young are sleeping in them now. Boots off, armor hung on the wall, breathing the deep and dreamless breath of people who believe the worst is finally behind them. Mothers are letting their children stay up late. Old soldiers are laughing. Somewhere in the upper city, someone is singing. And standing among them, unheard, unheeded, dismissed as a madwoman by every single person who loves her, is a young woman who knows exactly what is inside the wooden horse in the square, and exactly how many of these people will be alive at dawn. Tonight, we are not going to tell the story of the clever Greeks and their brilliant trick. We have all heard that story. Tonight we are going to stand on the other side of the wall. We are going to walk the streets of Troy as its own people walked them, and we are going to watch a civilization end from the inside. Good evening and welcome back. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the old myths, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and let us go back 3,000 years to a windy plain beside a narrow sea where a city is about to have its last ordinary afternoon. The city that was. Before it was a ruin, before it was a lesson, before it was a name that poets used as a shorthand for everything that can be lost, Troy was simply a place where people lived. It sat on a low rise above a broad and windy plain, in the northwest corner of what we now call Anatolia, close enough to the water that you could taste salt in the air on certain mornings, and close enough to the narrow strait the Greeks called the Hellespont, that whoever held the city held the door between two seas. Ships bound north toward the grainlands and the horse country had to pass beneath its walls. Ships coming south with amber and hides and metal had to pass beneath them too. That geography made Troy rich, and being rich made Troy watched, and being watched in the end made Troy a target. But for generations before any of that mattered, it was simply home, smoke from cooking fires, wheel ruts worn into stone, the smell of horses because the Trojans were famous for their horses, and the plain outside the walls was made for them. The people of the city traced themselves back to Dardanus, who came from the islands and settled on the slopes of Mount Ida, that great forested mountain that stands over the plain like a patient elder. From Dardanus came Erichthonius, and from him, Tros, whose name the whole land eventually carried. Tros had 3 sons. One of them, Ganymede, was so beautiful that Zeus himself took him up to Olympus to pour wine for the gods, and in exchange sent down a gift of immortal horses, a debt of honor between a god and a grieving father. Another son, Assaracus, stayed in the older settlement of Dardania and became the ancestor of a quieter branch of the family, one that will matter enormously before this night is over. And the third son, Elos, went down onto the plain and founded a city and named it after himself, Ilios. Ilion, the city we call Troy, carried both names for the rest of its life, and both names outlived it. It was Elos who received the object that mattered most. According to the tradition, as he stood over the foundations of his new city, a wooden image of the goddess Athena fell from the sky and landed in the enclosure. This was the Palladium. It was not a decoration, and it was not a trophy. It was a promise. As long as the Palladium remained inside the walls, the city could not be taken. Hold this, the heavens seemed to say, and you will hold everything. Remember that, because it will matter. And then came the walls themselves, and here the story turned strange and beautiful, and a little bitter. Ilus was succeeded by his son Laomedon, and it was Laomedon who built the great circuit wall, though he did not build it with Trojan hands. In the older tellings, Poseidon and Apollo had taken part in a conspiracy against Zeus, and as punishment they were stripped of their divinity for a season and sent down to labor for a mortal king. 2 gods, hauling stone, Poseidon raised the wall, course upon course, a ring of hewn blocks so massive and so precisely fitted that no army in the world could climb them. Apollo kept the flocks and kept the workers free of plague. Some accounts add a mortal to the work as well, Aeacus. And note that the section he built was the one weak seam in an otherwise perfect ring, the only stretch of wall raised by human hands, rather than divine ones. When the year was finished and the wall stood, Laomedon looked at the two laborers who had served him, and he refused to pay them. This is the wound underneath everything that follows. It is easy to think of Troy's fall as beginning with Paris and Helen, but the Trojans themselves would have told you it began generations earlier, with a king who decided that a promise to a god was a promise he could break. Apollo answered with pestilence. Poseidon answered with a flood and a sea monster that came up out of the water and took the people of the plain. An oracle told Laomedon there was only one way to stop it, and so the king, who would not pay his debts, bound his own daughter Hesione to a rock at the water's edge, to be devoured. She was saved. Heracles happened to be passing, killed the monster, and asked in return only for the immortal horses that Zeus had given the family long ago. Laomedon agreed, and then, being who he was, Laomedon refused to pay a second time. Heracles came back with an army. He breached the wall at exactly the place where a mortal had built it, and he killed Laomedon. And he killed every one of Laomedon's sons but one. That one was a boy called Podarces. And he survived because his sister Hesione begged for his life and paid for it with a golden veil. Because he had been bought, the boy took a new name, and that name meant something close to the purchased one, or the ransomed one. His name was Priam. Think about that for a moment, because the Trojans certainly did. The last king of Troy was a child who watched his father's arrogance destroy his family, watched his brothers cut down, and was spared only because someone paid for him. He grew up knowing exactly what a broken promise costs, and he rebuilt. Under Priam, Troy became greater than it had ever been under Laomedon. The walls were repaired, the treasury filled, the horses multiplied. Allies came from all across the region, from Thrace and Lycia and Phrygia and the Amazon country, drawn by trade and marriage and mutual interest. And they came because Priam was the sort of king who kept his word. He was generous to strangers. He was famously almost recklessly hospitable. Later, when everything was burning, that hospitality would be the exact lever the Greeks used to pry the city open. He had a wife, Hecuba, a woman from a royal line of her own, and together they had a family so large it became proverbial. 50 sons, the poets say, and many daughters, some by Hecuba and some by other women of the household, all raised inside the same enormous palace complex on the citadel. Hector, the eldest and the best of them, a man so decent that even the Greeks who killed him spoke of him with something like grief. Paris, who was exposed as an infant because of a prophecy and lived anyway, which tells you something about how prophecy works in these stories. Deiphobus, Helenus, Politus, Troilus, Polydorus, the youngest still a child when the war came, and the daughters, Cassandra and Polyxena, and Laodice and Crisa, moving through the women's quarters of a palace that must have been, on an ordinary evening, one of the noisiest and warmest places in the ancient world. The citadel at the heart of the city was called Pergamos, and the great gate that faced the plain was the Scaean Gate, and buried somewhere near it, according to the old belief, was the tomb of Laomedon himself. As long as that grave lay undisturbed, they said the walls would hold. So, this was Troy, a city with a curse in its foundations and a blessing in its temple. A city built by gods who had been cheated and were still angry about it. A city ruled by a good man born out of his father's catastrophe. A city full of children. Hold that picture in your mind. The smoke and the horses and the noise and the 50 sons. Because everything from here is subtraction. The 10th year. By the time our story properly begins, the Trojans have been under siege for nearly 10 years, and it is important to understand what that actually means, because the word siege makes it sound tidier than it was. The Greeks had not simply parked their ships on the beach and waited. For 9 years they had ranged up and down the coast, sacking the smaller allied towns, one by one, burning the fields, taking the cattle, carrying off the women. Every year the ring of friendly places around Troy grew smaller. Every year the supply lines got thinner, and the allies got fewer and more expensive to keep. The city itself was never truly starved, because the walls were unbreachable, and the roads inland stayed open, but the world outside those walls had been steadily eaten away. and everyone in Troy knew it. And then, in the 10th year, they lost Hector. It is hard to overstate what that did to the city. Hector was not simply their best fighter. He was the axis the whole place turned on. He was the one who went out every morning and came back every evening. The one whose presence on the wall meant that things were still under control. When Achilles killed him beneath those same walls and dragged his body behind a chariot in front of his own parents and his own wife, something in Troy broke that never mended. The city had been at war for a decade. Now it was at war, and it was grieving. And grief is heavier than war. Priam went out alone, at night, across the plain, into the tent of the man who had killed his son, and knelt down and kissed the hands that had done it, and asked for the body back. It is one of the oldest and most extraordinary scenes in all of literature, and from inside Troy, it must have been almost unbearable to watch him go, and almost unbearable to watch him return. The old king came back with his boy's body in a cart. They held the funeral. For 11 days there was a truce, and they built the pyre, and Andromache held her son up so the child could see, and Hecuba spoke over the fire. And Helen wept, and said that in all the years she had lived in that house, Hector had never once said a cruel word to her. It is worth pausing here to think about what daily life actually looked like inside those walls in that final year, because the poets tend to keep the camera on the battlefield, and the truth is that most people in Troy never went to the battlefield at all. Troy was crowded. That is the first thing. When the Greeks began sacking the surrounding towns, the surviving populations came in through the gates and did not go out again, and a city built for a certain number of people had been holding several times that number for the better part of a decade. Families were doubled and tripled into houses. Storerooms had been converted into living space. There were people in Troy who had spent 9 years sleeping in a corridor of somebody else's home and being politely grateful about it. Water and food came in from the interior, which is why the city never starved. But a siege economy is a strange and grinding thing. Everything was rationed by custom rather than law. Metal went to weapons, cloth went to the army. Craftsmen, who had once made beautiful things, spent a decade making replacement fittings for chariots and repairing the same helmets over and over until there was more repair than helmet. There would have been a whole generation of young men in that city who had learned a trade that consisted entirely of maintenance. And the allies. Troy's defense rested heavily on contingents from other peoples, from Lycia and Thrace and Phrygia and Paeonia and beyond. And those men had to be housed and fed and kept content inside a city that was not theirs. Some of them had been there for years. Some had married locally. Some resented being there and said so. There is a moment in the older poetry where Hector himself complains that the allies are eating the city's substance and that the treasury has been emptied paying for them, and you can hear in it the exhaustion of a man doing accounts at midnight. Then there was the sound of it. A besieged city is never quiet. There is always somebody on the wall, calling down, always the noise of repair work, always the particular murmur of a crowd waiting for news. When a battle was fought out on the plain, the whole city could hear it, and the women went up onto the towers to watch, which is one of the most quietly horrific facts about that war. They could see, not clearly, not enough to identify individuals in the press, but enough to see whether the line was holding and which way the dust was moving. And then they came down and waited at the gate to find out who was in the carts. And every year there were fewer people on the wall who remembered peace, and mean children who had been born inside it and had never once been outside the gates in their lives. Think about that. There were young people in Troy on the last night who had literally never seen their own countryside, who knew the plain only as a shape below them, who had grown up in a city where the horizon was a wall. That is who the Greeks were besieging. Not an army, a stuffed, exhausted, patient, argumentative, overfull city that had organized every single aspect of its life around the possibility of a bad afternoon. Then the truce ended, and the war resumed, and Troy went looking for someone to replace the irreplaceable. They found, for a while, remarkable people. First came Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, riding down from the north with 12 companions. She came, the tradition says, carrying a private grief of her own, seeking purification for an accidental killing, and she threw herself into Troy's defense with a ferocity. For a few days, the Trojans pushed the Greeks back toward the ships again. From the walls, the women of Troy watched a woman fighting for them, and something like hope came back into the streets. Then Achilles met her on the field and killed her. And the story that follows is one of the strangest in the entire cycle, because it says that when he pulled the helmet from her head and saw her face, he was overcome with sorrow at what he had done. That did not help Troy. She was dead either way. Then came Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, son of the goddess of the dawn, leading an army from the east and wearing armor made by the same divine smith who had made Achilles' own. Again the city lifted. Again the Greeks were driven back. Memnon killed Antilochus, the young son of old Nestor, and for a brief window it genuinely looked as though the balance might tip. Then Achilles came for him, and Memnon died too, and his mother the dawn goddess carried his body away, and, they say, her tears became the dew that falls every morning on every field in the world. Twice now, the Trojans had been given a champion. Twice, the same man had taken him away. And then, at last, that man died as well. Paris killed him. Paris, the brother everyone in Troy had complicated feelings about. The one whose choice had started all of it, standing on the wall or standing in the gateway with a bow, and the god Apollo guiding the arrow, and Achilles going down at the Scaean gate with a wound in his heel. In some versions it happened in an ambush at a temple, in others it happened in the open, in the press of battle, with the arrow arriving out of nowhere the way arrows do. Here is the thing that the Trojans learned in that moment, and it is one of the saddest lessons in the story. They had spent 10 years believing that if Achilles were gone, they would be saved. He was gone, and nothing was saved. The Greeks fought over his body and dragged it back to the ships. They burned him and buried his ashes with those of his companion in a great mound above the shore, a mound so large that Trojan children would grow up seeing it on the horizon and knowing what it was. And then the Greeks stayed exactly where they were. The war did not end. It only changed shape and became something colder and more calculating, a war of prophecies and thefts and locked doors, in which the great single combats mattered less than the quiet questions of what a city needs in order to stand, and how you take those things away from it, one by one. That is the war that killed Troy, not the spears, the subtraction, the unraveling. If you had walked through Troy in the months after Achilles died, you would have found a city that looked, from the outside, very much as it always had. The walls stood, the gates held, the towers were manned. Nothing had visibly changed. But the Greeks had captured a man named Helenus, and everything was about to change very quickly. To understand how that happened, we have to go back a little, because Troy's final unraveling begins not with a battle, but with a funeral and an argument. Paris died. Of course he did. The archer who had brought down the greatest warrior in the world was himself brought down by an archer, which is the kind of symmetry these stories cannot resist. The Greeks had learned from a prophecy that they could not take Troy without the bow of Heracles, and that bow was in the possession of a man named Philoctetes, whom they had abandoned on a lonely island 9 years earlier because a snakebite had left him with a wound that would not heal, and a smell no one could stand to be near. They went back for him. They brought him to the camp. Their physician healed the wound at last, and the man they had thrown away like refuse walked out onto the plain with the bow of Heracles in his hands and shot Paris down. Paris did not die immediately. There is a strand of the tradition, quiet and terrible, that says he was carried up to Mount Ida to find the nymph Ionon, who had been his first love long ago when he was still a herdsman who did not know he was a prince, and who alone had the knowledge to cure him. She refused. He died on the mountainside, and then she followed him into death. Too late, the way people in these stories always are. His body was recovered and buried, and immediately the family began to tear itself apart over what came next, because Helen was still in the city, and now Helen was a widow. 2 of Priam's sons wanted her, Deiphobus and Helenus. Deiphobus won and married her, and Helenus, humiliated in front of the whole court, walked out of Troy and went up onto the mountain to live alone. Read that again, because it is one of the most quietly catastrophic decisions in the entire war, and it was made in a temper. Helenus was a seer. He and his sister Cassandra had received the gift together, in one telling, as infants left overnight in a temple, where serpents came and cleaned their ears so that they could hear what was coming. But where Cassandra had been cursed to be disbelieved, Helenus had not. Helenus was trusted. Helenus knew what Troy needed in order to survive, in specific and practical detail, and Helenus was now sitting alone on a mountainside, furious with his own family, entirely unguarded. Odysseus went up and took him. We do not know exactly what passed between them. The old summaries are brief and businesslike about it, which somehow makes it worse. Helenus was ambushed, captured, brought to the Greek camp, and there he told them what they needed to know. Some accounts say he was compelled. Others say he gave it freely, still burning over the insult. The tradition is not unanimous on his motive, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What is consistent is the content. Troy would fall, he said, when 3 conditions were met. The Greeks needed the bow of Heracles, which they now had. They needed Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, who was still on the island of Scyros and had never seen a battlefield. And they needed the Palladium out of the city, because while that image of Athena stood inside the walls, Troy could not be taken. The Greeks moved fast. Odysseus sailed to Scyros and came back with a boy of perhaps 16, who put on his dead father's armor and turned out to be, in the most literal way, his father's son. Neoptolemus arrived on the plain and began killing. He cut down the Mysian leader Eurypylus, who had come as one of Troy's last great allies, the grandson of Heracles himself, and with him died the last significant reinforcement Troy would ever receive. And then, on some black night with no moon, 2 men came over the wall. The theft of the Palladium is a small story compared to the great battles, and it is the one that actually ended the war. Odysseus and Diomedes came into Troy in disguise, filthy and half-starved, dressed as beggars, moving through the streets of a city that had been trained by 10 years of siege to be suspicious of everything except the poor. There is a strand of the story, and it is an old one, that says Helen recognized Odysseus and said nothing. Whether she helped them or simply let them pass is one of those questions the tradition has never resolved and probably never wanted to. They found the temple. They took the image, they killed the guards on the way out, and went back over the wall into the dark. And by morning the thing that had fallen from heaven into the hands of the founder of the city was gone. Nobody sounded an alarm that changed anything. What could anyone have done? You cannot chase a promise once it has left. Consider now what Troy actually looked like at the end of that season. From inside, Hector dead, Paris dead, Troilus dead years before, Penthesilea dead, Memnon dead, Eurypylus dead, Helenus gone over to the enemy, the allies thinned to almost nothing, the best of the fighting men gone into the ground, and the ones still standing being asked to hold a circuit of wall designed for an army, 3 times their number. And now the holy thing that had guaranteed the city's survival simply not there anymore, an empty plinth in a dim room, and a priesthood with nothing left to guard. The people did not know all of this. That is worth saying clearly. The theft of the Palladium may well have been kept quiet, or half known, or rumoured and denied, but you cannot hide the arithmetic of a funeral. Everyone in that city could count. Everyone had watched the processions go up to the pyres, and had noticed that the crowds attending them got smaller each time, because the mourners themselves kept being subtracted. What Troy had left, at the end, was walls and stubbornness, and the hope that the Greeks would eventually get tired and go home. And then, one morning, they looked out, and the Greeks had gone home. The morning the sea was empty. Imagine waking up to silence. For 10 years, the first sound of any Trojan morning had been the sound of an enemy. Not always loud, not always close, but always there, a low, continuous presence, at the edge of hearing, the way you can hear the sea from a house, near a coast even when you are not listening for it. Hammering from the shipyards, the lowing of stolen cattle, horns, voices carrying across flat ground the way voices do. 10,000 men living on a beach make a noise that never entirely stops, and every person in Troy under the age of 10 had never known a morning without it. On this particular morning, there was nothing. The first watchman on the wall would have noticed it before he understood it, the way you notice a clock has stopped in a room you have sat in for years. Then he would have looked out toward the shore, and the shore would have been empty. They were gone. All of them. The whole enormous sprawl of the Greek camp. That second city that had grown up on the sand, with its own streets, and its own graveyards, and its own smoke, was simply not there. The ships were off the beach. The tents were down. In their place was a long, scarred stretch of ground, black with the marks of 1,000 cooking fires, littered with the debris that armies leave, and beyond it the empty water going out flat and grey to the horizon. Word went through Troy faster than any word had ever travelled in that city. People came out of their houses. The wall would have been packed shoulder to shoulder within the hour, and there would have been a sound rising off it that nobody in Troy had heard in a decade, which is the sound of a large number of people laughing at once. Then somebody opened the Scaean gate. Think about what that gate had meant. It was not just a door. For 10 years it had been the exact and terrible boundary between alive and not alive. Hector had gone out through it, and had come back through it, dead. Every farewell in that city had happened in its shadow, and now the bar came up, and the leaves swung open, and the people of Troy walked out onto their own plain. They went down to the shore. They walked through the ruins of the camp like tourists, like people wandering through a house that a hated neighbor has finally vacated. Here is where the Myrmidons were. Here is where Achilles kept his ships. Here is the place they used to launch from when they came for us. Some of them would have been picking through what was left. Children would have been running. Old men would have been standing very still, looking at the sand, thinking about sons. Walk that beach with them for a moment, because it is one of the strangest scenes in the story, and it almost never gets told. For 10 years, the Greek camp had been the most closely observed and least understood place in the Trojan world. From the towers you could see its shape, its smoke, the masts of the ships pulled up beyond the tide line, and you could guess at what happened inside it, and every guess was terrible. It was where the enemy slept. It was where Hector's Trojan women had been taken. It was where Hector's body had been kept and abused for 11 days while his mother watched from the wall. To the people of Troy, that stretch of sand had not been a military installation. It had been the underworld, with a fence around it. And now they were walking through it, and it was just a mess. Fire pits, hundreds of them, grey and cold. The long, shallow trenches where the ships had rested, filled with sand. Broken pottery everywhere, because armies break pottery. Ropes. Rotted leather. Post holes where the huts had stood, and the outlines in the sand where walls had been. Rubbish heaps that had been picked over, already. The remains of a defensive wall and ditch, half filled in. And graves. That is the detail that must have silenced people. The Greeks had been dying on that beach for 10 years too, and they had buried and burned their own out there, and the ground was marked with their mounds. Trojan families walked past the graves of the men who had killed their sons and had absolutely no idea what to do with the feeling. There would have been looting, of course. There always is. Someone found a good cooking pot. Someone found a knife worth keeping. Children would have been picking up arrowheads, which is a thing children have done on abandoned battlefields, for as long as there have been battlefields. And rising over all of it, at the end of the beach, the great mound where Achilles was buried, so big it had been built as a landmark for ships, and the Trojans, standing at the bottom of it, looking up. That is the mood you need for what comes next. Not caution, not vigilance. Wonder and a kind of stunned wandering relief, and 100 small distractions pulling attention in every direction at once. And out in the middle of the plain, on the flat ground between the city and the sea, stood the horse. It is difficult to recover how genuinely strange this object was, because we all grew up knowing what it was for. Try to set that aside. What the Trojans walked out and found was an enormous wooden animal, taller than a house, built with real craft, standing on the churned earth, with its head up, and its flanks smooth and its whole body raised on a platform. It had not been there the previous evening. It had been assembled, evidently, over some period of time within the camp, and hauled out, and left. There was an inscription on it, in some tellings, dedicating it to Athena as a thank offering for a safe voyage home, and around it, the entire population of Troy gathered and began to argue. This is the moment the whole story turns on, and it deserves to be understood properly, because it is very easy to look at it from 3,000 years away and think the Trojans were fools. They were not fools. They were exhausted. 10 years. Understand what 10 years of that does to people. They had buried their princes. They had rationed and mourned, and stood watches and lied to their children about when it would be over. And now, on an ordinary morning, it appeared to be over, and every single person standing on that plain desperately wanted it to be true. That is not stupidity. That is the most human thing in the world. Hope is not a failure of reasoning. It is what people run on when reasoning has been giving them nothing but bad news for a decade. Still, there were voices of caution, and the tradition preserves them. A man called Capys, who belonged to the older Dardanian branch of the royal house, said what several people were thinking: throw it into the sea, or burn it, or at the very least bore into it and find out what is inside. He was not being clever. He was being sensible in the plainest possible way. You do not accept a large sealed container from an enemy who has been trying to kill you for 10 years. Others disagreed. Thymoetes, one of the elders, argued for bringing it up to the citadel. Some wanted it left where it stood, untouched, as a monument. Some wanted it dedicated in the temple. And the crowd swayed back and forth between these positions, in that way that crowds do, where the argument is never really about the evidence, and is always about which future the people want to live in. To burn the horse was to say the war might not be over. To bring it home was to say it was. You can guess which way 100,000 exhausted people leaned. Priam himself came down, an old man now, very old, having outlived most of his own children, standing on the plain outside his walls in daylight, for the first time in years, looking up at a wooden animal and being asked to decide. And into that argument, at exactly the right moment, walked a priest. The priest and the liar. His name was Laocoön, and he was a priest, and he came running down from the citadel with a crowd at his heels, shouting before he had even reached them. He wanted to know what was wrong with all of them. Do you actually believe, he asked, that they have gone? Do you believe that any gift from that army has ever once arrived without a knife in it? Either there are men inside this thing, or it is an engine built to look over our walls, or it is some device to be used against our houses. Whatever it is a trap, and you are standing around it like children at a festival. And then he said the line that has outlived him, the line that every schoolchild in the Roman world would eventually learn by heart, which in plain words comes to this: I am afraid of Greeks, and I am most afraid of them when they are giving me presents. Then he did something about it. He took a heavy spear, and he ran forward, and he drove it hard into the horse's flank. The whole plain heard the sound it made. It boomed. Not the dull thud of solid timber, but a deep hollow reverberation, a cavern of a sound, and from inside came a rattle and a shudder, the unmistakable noise of metal shifting against wood. Armor, men in armor, packed into a dark space, jolted by the impact, freezing in place with their hands pressed against each other's mouths. For one heartbeat, Troy nearly saved itself. The tradition is very clear that in that instant, had anyone acted, it would have been over. The spear was still standing in the wood. The sound was still hanging in the air. All it needed was one person to say, "Open it," and one axe, and there would have been no fall of Troy, only a very short and extremely one-sided fight on a windy plain, and a story about how a clever trick went wrong. But nobody moved. The crowd was uncertain. The sound was strange, and strange sounds can be explained away, and the moment stretched and cooled, the way moments do. And then there was a commotion at the edge of the crowd, and everyone turned to look, and the chance was gone forever. Shepherds were coming up from the direction of the marshes, dragging a man between them. He was Greek. He was young. His hands were tied. He was filthy and shaking, and he had clearly been hiding for some time, and the crowd surged toward him the way any crowd surges toward the only enemy it can actually reach. They mocked him. Trojan boys, the tradition says, ran forward and jeered at him and competed with each other to insult him. Consider what that tells you. Consider what a decade of siege does to children. And the young man stood in the middle of that ring of hostile faces and looked around and asked, in a voice full of despair, where on earth he was supposed to go now. "The Greeks want to kill me," he said. "And you want to kill me? There is no land left on the whole earth that will have me." The crowd went quiet, and in that quiet, the most successful liar in the history of the ancient world began to work. His name was Sinon, and every word he said had been prepared in advance. He told them he was a relation of a man named Palamedes, a Greek who had opposed the war from the beginning and who had been destroyed for it. Odysseus, he said, had framed him with forged evidence and false gold and had him executed on a charge of treason that everyone knew was a lie. And Sinon, being family, had been foolish enough to say so out loud. From that day, he said Odysseus had wanted him dead. Then he came to the good part. He told them the Greeks had wanted to leave many times, that they had loaded the ships and been driven back by storms, over and over, until they finally sent to the oracle and received an answer they did not like. "Once," he said, "when the fleet first sailed to this war, you bought your winds with the blood of a girl. Now you must buy them again with the blood of a man." The Trojans were listening now. They knew about the girl. Everyone knew about Iphigenia, the daughter Agamemnon had put on an altar at the beginning of all this, so that the fleet could sail. That detail was true, and true details are what make lies stand up. And the lot had fallen on him, Sinon said. On him. Odysseus had arranged it naturally. They had bound him and prepared the salt and the fillets and the whole apparatus of a human sacrifice. And on the night before it, he had chewed through his bonds and run and hidden in a reed bed in the marsh, with the water up to his chin, and lain there while the fleet sailed away without him. And now here he was, and he would never see his home or his children or his father again. And would they please just kill him and be done with it, because the Greeks would certainly reward them for it. Priam ordered him untied. That is the moment, not the horse, not the wall. That, an old man who had knelt in an enemy tent and kissed the hands that killed his son, looking at a young stranger in the dirt and deciding that whatever this was, it was not going to be answered with cruelty. He had the ropes cut. He spoke to him kindly. He told him to forget the Greeks, that from now on he was one of them. And then Priam asked the question Sinon had been waiting 9 days in a swamp to be asked. "What is the horse for?" And Sinon, freed and forgiven and standing among people who now felt slightly guilty about how they had treated him, raised his hands and swore an enormous oath by everything holy, and told them. It was an offering, he said, to Athena. The goddess had turned against the Greek army after they defiled her temple and stole the Palladium out of Troy. From the moment that image came into the camp, he said, everything had gone wrong. The statue had wept. Flames had come out of its eyes. Their prophet had told them there was no hope of taking Troy now, unless they went home first and came back with new omens. So they had gone, but they had left this behind to appease the goddess, and they had built it enormous on purpose. Why enormous? Because if you Trojans ever managed to get it inside your walls, the goddess would transfer her protection to you, and you would carry the war into Greece itself. And it would be our children who suffered. And that is why we built it too big to fit through your gates. Harm it, and you are destroyed. Bring it in, and you cannot be. It was as a piece of construction, close to perfect. It explained the size. It explained the abandonment. It explained the theft of the Palladium, which some Trojans already knew about and were frightened by. And it turned that theft from a catastrophe into an advantage. It gave them a reason not to touch it, and a reason to want it desperately. And it did all of this while flattering exactly the belief that mattered most to them, which was that the gods had not abandoned Troy. There was still hesitation, there would have been, and so the sea sent something to end it. Out beyond the shallows, 2 enormous serpents came in over the water. The old descriptions are extraordinarily vivid about this, and it is one of the images the ancient world could not stop drawing and carving and painting. For 1,000 years afterward, their coils rose in loops above the surface. Their crests stood blood-red above the waves. Their eyes were burning. They came ashore hissing, and the crowd broke and scattered, and the serpents went straight, without hesitation, without confusion, in a line as direct as a decision, toward Laocoön. He was at the altar. He had been chosen by lot to make a sacrifice to Poseidon, and he was standing there with his 2 young sons beside him. They took the boys first. That is the detail that makes the sculpture of this scene one of the most agonizing objects to survive from antiquity, that the serpents went for the children while the father watched. And then, when he ran forward with a weapon to save them, they took him too and wrapped him twice around the body and twice around the throat, and his bellowing carried across the plain like the sound of a wounded bull that has broken away from an altar. Then the serpents let go and slid away up into the citadel, into the temple of Athena herself, and coiled at the feet of the goddess's image, and lay still beneath the circle of her shield. There is no version of this scene in which the Trojans could have read it correctly. Think about it as they had to. A priest attacks an offering dedicated to Athena with a spear. Moments later, monsters come out of the sea and destroy him, and then go and lie down Athena's feet, like dogs, returning to a master. What conclusion is available? Only one. The goddess is angry, the offering is real, and the priest was wrong. We know from outside the story that this is not what happened. We know the sea serpents were not a verdict, but a murder. But nobody standing on that plain had our vantage point. They had a corpse, a portent, and a very persuasive young man who had just been vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. A shout went up, "Take it to the temple, take it to the goddess, get it inside." And Sinon, standing quietly at the edge of everything, would have let out one long breath. Cassandra and the breaking of the wall. Now we have to talk about her, because she is the reason this story hurts in a particular way that the other great disasters of myth do not. Cassandra was one of Priam's daughters, and by every account she was the most beautiful of them, and she was a priestess, and she could see the future with perfect and unfailing accuracy, and not one person had believed a single word she had said in years. The tradition gives us 2 accounts of how she got that way, and they disagree, and it is worth being honest about that. In the more common one, Apollo desired her and offered her the gift of prophecy in exchange for her love. She accepted the gift, then she refused him, and because a god's gift cannot be taken back once given, he did the only thing he could do, which was to leave the gift intact and poison the reception of it. "Speak," he told her, "speak truly, always, and be believed by no one, ever." In the other account, she and her brother Helenus received the gift together as infants in a temple, when serpents came in the night and cleansed their ears so that they could hear what was coming, and the curse attached to her later, after she rejected the god. Either way, the result is the same, and it is one of the cruelest arrangements ever devised by any mythology. She was not blinded. She was not silenced. She was given complete knowledge and total powerlessness at the same time. She was made into a woman who could stand in a room and watch, in advance and in detail, everything terrible that was about to happen to everyone she loved, and open her mouth, and be patted on the arm. She had told them about Paris. Before he ever sailed, she said he would bring the ruin of the city, and they ignored it. She had told them when he came back with Helen, and they ignored that too. She had spent 10 years watching her prophecies come true, one after another, and the strange thing, the thing that must have made her genuinely half mad, is that being proved right never helped. Every time she was vindicated, they simply did not connect it to the next thing she said. The curse did not merely make people disbelieve her predictions, it made them incapable of learning that her predictions were reliable. Imagine living inside that. Imagine loving people who think your love is a symptom. By this point in the war, her own family regarded her as unwell. There is a strand of the tradition, and it is old, that says Priam had her confined, that she was kept apart, that when the fits came on her, she was shut away for her own protection and everyone else's peace. Her voice, when she used it, had become something people arranged their day around, avoiding. And now, on the plain, with the whole city cheering and hauling ropes, she came down among them and told them exactly what was in the horse. She named it. She said there were armed men inside. She said the city would burn, and her father would die, and her mother would be led away in chains, and she herself would be dragged out of a temple by the hair. She was not vague. She was never vague. That was the horror of her. She was specific and precise, and completely correct, and she was screaming it into the faces of people who had just watched a god apparently endorse the horse with a miracle. There is a version in which she went further than words. In it, she seized an axe in one hand and a burning torch in the other and ran at the horse herself, a princess of Troy, trying with her own arms to save the city that had spent a decade laughing at her. They took the axe away from her. They put out the torch. Somebody led her back inside, gently, the way you lead someone whose grief has finally overwhelmed them. And someone else said what they always said, which was that it was very sad about Priam's daughter, and was not it a shame, and had anyone told her mother? Then they went back to the ropes, because the horse still had to get inside, and the horse did not fit. This is the part that people forget. The Trojans did not simply open a gate and walk it in. It was too big. It had been built too big on purpose, precisely so that this decision would have to be made in front of everyone. So they took down a section of their own wall. Sit with that for a moment. That wall was the single most valuable object the Trojan people possessed. It had been raised by a god. It had held for 10 years against the greatest army the Greek world had ever assembled. Every man who had died defending the city had died so that the wall would not be breached. It had never been breached. In 10 years of siege, the Greeks had never once gotten through it. And on a bright afternoon, with music playing, the Trojans got up on their own wall with tools and knocked a hole in it. And they did it happily. They laid down rollers under the horse's platform. They fixed ropes around its neck, and then the whole city took hold and began to pull, and it came up off the plain and rolled toward the gap. And the tradition says that girls and boys walked alongside it singing hymns, and that everyone wanted to put a hand on the rope because it was good luck to be part of it. Mothers lifted children so they could touch it as it went by. Flowers were thrown. This was not a grim procession. This was the best day anyone had had in 10 years. And 4 times, the old accounts say, the horse stopped on the threshold. 4 times, from inside its belly, came the clash of weapons. 4 separate warnings, each one loud enough to be heard. And every single time the crowd simply heaved harder on the ropes and shouted encouragement to each other and got it moving again. They dragged it up through the streets to the citadel. They set it in the open square before the temple. They hung garlands on it, ropes of green leaves, and cut flowers looped over that enormous wooden neck. And by evening the whole square was decorated for a festival, and the smoke of offerings was going up from every altar in Troy. And the men inside the horse were listening to all of it, close enough to hear individual voices, close enough to hear children. The last feast. There is something almost unbearable about the last few hours of Troy, and it is this. They were happy, not relieved, not cautiously optimistic, happy in the full and uncomplicated way that people are happy perhaps 3 or 4 times in a life. The war was over. Everyone said so. The gods had shown a sign. The offering stood in the square with flowers on it. Tomorrow, the fields could be worked again. Tomorrow, the roads would be open. Tomorrow, someone was probably thinking, we can go and find where they buried the men we could not bring home. Let us walk through the city on that last evening, because it deserves to be seen alive one more time before it stops existing. Down in the lower town, the ordinary houses, doors standing open because it was warm, and because for the first time in a decade there was no reason to bar them. Cooking fires. The particular smell of a city where everyone is preparing food at the same time. Wine, and a great deal of it, hoarded through years of siege and finally worth opening. Old men, who had not been drunk since before the war, sitting in doorways getting comprehensively drunk. Somebody's grandmother telling a story badly. Somebody's brother singing off key and being cheered anyway. Soldiers going home. This is the detail that catches in the throat. Men who had spent 10 years sleeping in the guard rooms and on the towers walked back to their own houses that evening and took off their armor and set it in a corner and did not put it near the door where they could reach it. Because why would they? They ate at their own tables. Some of them saw children who had grown up while they were on the wall. Up on the citadel, in the palace, the royal family. Priam, exhausted and enormously relieved, an old man who had begun to believe he might die in peace. After all, Hecuba, who had buried more sons than most women bear. allowing herself for one evening to sit among the ones she had left. Deiphobus, who had won the argument over Helen and had her in his house. Andromache, Hector's widow, with her small son Astyanax, whose name meant Lord of the City and who was still young enough to be carried. Polyxena, Laodice, Creusa, and her husband Aeneas of the Dardanian branch, and their little boy Ascanius. Anchises, Aeneas's aged father, who could no longer walk without help. And somewhere, apart from all of them, Cassandra, who knew. Try to hold both of these in your mind at once. That is the whole tragedy of the last night of Troy. In every warm-lit room in that city there was somebody laughing, and in one room there was a young woman who could see the walls burning and could not make anyone hear her over the noise of the celebration. The tradition preserves one more strange episode from that night, and it belongs to Helen. In an old story told long afterward in a hall in Sparta, Helen came out into the square alone and walked slowly around the horse, and she began to call up to it. She called the names of the Greek captains she knew were inside, one at a time, and as she called each name she imitated the voice of his wife, whether she was testing them or taunting them or trying to warn her countrymen, or trying to help them. The story does not say, and the ancient world argued about it for centuries. What it does say is that inside the horse, men who had not heard their wives' voices in 10 years nearly broke. Some of them started to answer, and Odysseus in the dark clamped his hands over their mouths and held them until she went away. Then the city went to sleep. This is the quietest part of the story and the most terrible. Troy, drunk, exhausted with joy, unguarded for the first time in 10 years, lay down and slept. The fires burned low. The last voices stopped. The garlands on the horse hung still in the dark. Watchfires that should have been lit were not lit, or were lit and left to die, because what exactly were they watching for? And out beyond the headland, in the deep water, in the lee of the island of Tenedos, the Greek fleet was already underway. They had never gone home. They had never intended to. They had sailed just far enough to drop below the horizon, anchored in the dark, and waited for the signal. And now, in the middle of the night, a single fire was lit on the highest point of the ruined camp, or on the stern of the flagship, and it burned steadily out across the water. Sinon saw it. He came through the sleeping city to the square, past the garlanded horse and the burnt-out offerings, and he climbed up and drew the bolt. The panel in the belly came open. A rope came down, and, one after another, in complete silence, they came out into the square of a city, where every door was unlocked, and every sword was in a corner, and every single person was asleep. The tradition gives the names, and they are the names the Trojans had spent 10 years fearing. Odysseus, who had planned it; Menelaus, whose wife was in a house 4 streets away; Neoptolemus, 16 years old, wearing his father's armor; Diomedes, Sthenelus, Machaon, Epeius, who had built the thing and had to be helped down because he was the least warlike of them. 30 men, or 40, or in some tellings only a handful, the accounts differ, and always have. They went first to the gates. They killed the men on watch, which cannot have been difficult, and they lifted the bars and they threw the great gates of Troy wide open from the inside, and out on the plain the whole Greek army, which had come ashore in silence and marched up in the dark, was already waiting. The night the walls failed, Aeneas was asleep when it started, and the first thing that happened to him was a dream. Hector came to him, not the Hector anyone wanted to see, not the shining prince in the plumed helmet, but Hector as he had been at the very end, filthy and torn, his hair matted with blood and dust, his feet swollen and pierced where the straps had gone through them when Achilles dragged him around the walls. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he wept. "Get out," he said. "Troy is finished. If any hand could have saved it, mine would have saved it. Take the sacred things, take the household gods, find a wall for them somewhere across the sea." And then Aeneas woke up and heard the noise. It is a specific noise, and everyone who has ever been in a city at the wrong moment knows what it is. It is the sound of a great many people, all realizing something at once. Screaming, but from too many directions at the same time to locate. Under it, the crackle that turns out to be roofs, and through the window, light where there should have been none, an orange flickering on the underside of the smoke. He went up onto the roof, and from there he could see the whole of it, and the tradition describes what he saw with a terrible simplicity: houses collapsing, the great mansion of one neighbor already gone, another house burning, the water of the strait far below throwing the fire back at the sky, and everywhere the shouting of men and the calling of horns. A priest named Panthus came stumbling past in the street below, dragging his grandson by the hand and carrying the sacred vessels from the temple of Apollo, and Aeneas called down to him for news. What Panthus said back is one of the bleakest lines in the whole story, and it comes to something like this: "It is over, it was ours, it is not ours anymore." The Greeks hold everything. The horse has poured out armed men into the middle of the city. Sinon has the gates. They are coming up from the shore in thousands. And Aeneas, who had just been told by the ghost of the greatest man Troy ever produced to run, put his armor on and went to fight anyway. Understand that this is not stupidity either. This is what people do. He did not have a plan. The tradition is explicit that he had no plan and knew he had none, that a kind of madness came over him, and the only clear thought he had was that it would be beautiful to die with a weapon in his hand. He went out into the streets, and other men came out and joined him, one at a time, out of the smoke. Ripheus, who was said to be the most just man in all of Troy, which the story notes with a terrible flatness, because the gods did not save him. Hypanis, Dymas, two brothers who came out of a burning house, and Coroebus, who does not get enough attention and deserves it. He was a young prince from Phrygia who had arrived in the city only days before, and he had come for one reason, which was that he was in love with Cassandra and wanted to marry her. He had arrived at the very end of the war, at the worst possible moment in the history of that city, to court a woman nobody listened to, and that night he fought like a man defending his own home, because in his mind he was. They went through the streets, and they had, briefly, a strange kind of success. In the dark and the smoke, with the fires throwing everything into confusion, they met a party of Greeks who mistook them for their own men. They killed them, and Coroebus had an idea. Take their armor. Take their shields and their crests and their signs. In a night like this, who can tell? So they did, Trojans in Greek armor, moving through their own burning city, pretending to be the men who were destroying it. And it worked. For a while it worked extremely well. They fell on group after group in the dark, and the Greeks, seeing familiar shields, did not raise their guard until it was too late. Some of them broke and ran back toward the ships. And then it went wrong in the way that ruses always go wrong, and the way it went wrong is the single cruelest thing that happens in the entire sack, because it happened over a woman being dragged out of a temple. They came into a square and saw Cassandra being hauled out of the sanctuary of Athena. Her hands were bound. Her hair was loose. She was being pulled along by a group of Greeks, and she was looking up at the sky, and her eyes, the old description says, were burning, because her eyes were all she had left to raise, since her hands were tied. Coroebus went straight at them. Of course he did, and the whole band followed him, and the fight in the square drew Greeks from every direction. And then, from the roof of the temple, Trojans looking down saw a body of men in Greek armor, attacking Greeks, and did the obvious thing, which was to throw everything they had at them. Their own people, roof tiles and beams and spears, rained down on the men in the false armor. And at the same moment the real Greeks recognized the deception, and came at them from the front. Coroebus died there, in the square, at the altar of the goddess, having accomplished nothing except being the only person in Troy who tried to save Cassandra. He never married her. He had come so recently that he had barely spoken to her. Ripheus, the most just man in Troy, died in the same square. Hypanis and Dymas died. The band that had gone out into the streets was cut to pieces, and Aeneas came out the other side of it, with two men, an old one who could barely keep up, and a young one who was already wounded, and behind them the square was full of Greeks, and the temple was on fire. That is what happened to the Trojan resistance. It lasted perhaps an hour. It was brave and disorganized, and doomed, and it consisted almost entirely of men who had gone to sleep believing the war was over, and who had been woken up by the smell of their own roofs. By now the fighting had contracted. The lower city was gone. What was left was the citadel, and up there the palace, and around the palace the last defenders in Troy were gathering, because that was where the king was, the palace and the death of Priam. The palace of Priam had been built to be magnificent. Now it had to be a fortress, and it was not one. Aeneas got up there by a back route, over the rooftops, along a passage that Andromache had used in better days when she used to bring her little boy to see his grandparents. From the roof he could look down into the courtyards, and what he saw was the Greeks already massed against the great doors, and Trojans on the battlements above throwing down whatever they could find. They were tearing the gilding off the roof beams, and hurling it they were prying up the ornamental towers, the decorative ones, and toppling them into the crowd below. Men who had run out of weapons were fighting with pieces of their own house. At the doors stood Neoptolemus. He was at most in his late teens. He had arrived at this war a few months earlier, a boy from a quiet island who had never seen a battle. He was wearing the armor of Achilles, and the descriptions of him at that door are terrifying, because they do not describe a man in a rage. They describe someone who is enjoying himself. He took an axe to the doors. He and his men hacked at the timber until they broke a panel out of it, and through the gap you could see straight down the long hall into the inner rooms, into the private heart of the palace, into the part of a house that guests never enter. And the tradition dwells on that, on the obscenity of a house's inside being made visible from the street. 50 bedchambers, it says. The rooms of the sons and their wives, all of it suddenly open to the air. Then the doors came down entirely, and they were inside. And after that, it was slaughter in corridors. In the innermost courtyard, under the open sky, there was an ancient altar to Zeus of the enclosure, the god who guards the boundary of a household, the god you appeal to when you have nothing left but the fact that this is your home. A great old bay tree grew beside it and leaned over it. Hecuba was there, and around her every daughter and daughter-in-law left in the palace, huddled at the altar like birds driven down by a storm. That is the image the tradition uses, and it is exactly right. They were holding the images of the gods in their arms, and into that courtyard came Priam. He had put on his armor. That is the detail that undoes people. An old man, so old he could barely carry the weight of it, who had not fought in years and years, buckling on a breastplate that no longer fitted him, and taking up a sword that his arms could not use, because his house was full of enemies, and he was the king, and he was not going to die unarmed. Hecuba saw him, and something in her broke. "What are you doing?" she said. "What weapon, what possible thought, has brought you here dressed like this? Not even Hector could help us now. Come here, this altar will protect all of us, or we will all die together." And she pulled him in beside her. And then Polites came running. Polites was one of Priam's sons, and he was younger, and he was wounded, and Neoptolemus was behind him. He came through the empty colonnades with a spear reaching for his back, out into the open courtyard, into the space directly in front of his mother and his father, and there Neoptolemus caught him and killed him. He died in front of them, on the stones in the middle of the courtyard where he had presumably played as a child. He poured out his life, the old phrase goes, in front of his parents' faces. And Priam, who had watched Achilles drag Hector around the walls, who had knelt and kissed the hands of his son's killer, who had endured more than any man in these stories endures, could not endure that. He did not stay silent. He shouted at the boy. He told him that for a crime like this, the gods, if there was any justice left in heaven, would pay him what he had earned, for making a father watch his son die, and fouling a father's eyes with it. And then he said the thing that must have cut deepest of all, which was this: Achilles was not like you. Achilles, whom you falsely claim as a father, was not like this to me. He respected a suppliant. He gave me back my son's body. He sent me home to my own kingdom. Then the old man threw his spear. It went a few feet. It struck the shield and hung there in the bronze, harmless, and rang. And Neoptolemus laughed at him and said that in that case he could go and complain about it to Achilles in person. He dragged him across the courtyard through the blood of his own son, which is the detail every ancient artist wanted to show and every ancient poet wanted to say, and he pushed him down onto the altar of Zeus and drove the sword into him up to the hilt. That was the end of Priam. 50 sons, 90 years or more of life, a boy who had been ransomed with a golden veil and grown into the greatest king his city ever had, dying face down on the god of hospitality's altar, killed by a teenager in front of his wife. The tradition, at this point, does something strange and completely devastating. It leaves the courtyard, and it shows you the body afterward, and it says, "Only this." He lies on the shore, a huge trunk with the head taken away from the shoulders, and a corpse without a name. The variants differ on the details, and I will be honest about that, because the ancient sources themselves were not unanimous. In one of the oldest accounts, the killing happens exactly there, at the altar, in the sanctuary. In another, Neoptolemus drags him away from the altar first and kills him at the door of the palace, which softens the sacrilege very slightly by moving it outside the holy ground. There is even a strand of the tradition that says Priam wanted it, that he had lost so much he went toward the sword. What no version disputes is that an old king was killed in his own house by the son of the man who killed his eldest son, and that the Greeks themselves, telling this story afterward, understood it as a crime. Because that is the thing about the sack of Troy. The people who won it did not remember it as a triumph. They remembered it as the night they went too far. And while all of that was happening in the palace, the city itself was being unmade, and it is worth stopping to describe how a city actually dies, because it is not quick and it is not clean. Fire in a Bronze Age city moves through the roofs. The walls were stone and mud brick and would not burn, but everything above them was timber and thatch and painted beam, and once one roof went, the roof next to it went, and the streets became chimneys. The old descriptions keep returning to the same image, which is of an enormous ash tree on a mountainside, being cut at the root by farmers working in shifts, leaning and shuddering, and threatening for a long time before it finally comes down with a groan. That is how Troy came apart, not in one collapse, in hours of leaning. The temples went. This is the part that horrified the ancient world most, because the temples were supposed to be the one category of building that stayed. The shrines on the citadel were stripped and burned, the altars were fouled, the sacred images were carried out and thrown onto the piles of plunder with the cups and the cauldrons, which meant that the gods of Troy were now, in the most literal sense, loot. There is an extraordinary moment in the tradition where Aeneas, standing in the middle of all this, is briefly allowed to see what mortals are not permitted to see. And what he sees is the gods themselves doing it, not sitting on a mountain deciding. Doing it. One of them at the wall with a trident, working the stones loose from their foundations, prying the whole circuit up out of the ground it had stood in since it was raised, and the entire city coming off its base. Whether you read that as literal or as the most honest metaphor anyone has ever written for what it feels like to watch your world end, the effect is the same. The message is that this was not a military defeat. Troy was not outfought. Troy was taken apart on purpose by powers that had decided it was time. And everything the Trojans did, the courage and the vigilance and the 10 years of holding on, had been happening inside a decision that had already been made somewhere else. The Trojans had lost. And the strangest thing about the way their story is told is that nobody in it, on either side, ever really says that they deserved to. The temples defiled. If you want to understand why the gods turned on the Greeks after Troy fell, this is the section that explains it. There were rules. Not laws exactly. Not anything anyone could enforce, but something older and more binding than law. A set of understandings about what you do not do, ever, under any circumstances. No matter who you are or how much you have suffered, or how right you believe yourself to be. You do not kill a man who has taken hold of an altar. You do not violate a suppliant. You do not defile a temple. These were not Trojan rules or Greek rules. They were the rules that made it possible for strangers to meet each other at all. On that night in that city, the Greeks broke all of them, and the ancient world never stopped talking about it. Start with Cassandra, because we left her being dragged across a square. She had run to the temple of Athena. It was the most logical place in the world to go. She was a priestess. It was the sanctuary of the city's protecting goddess. She got inside, and she took hold of the wooden image of Athena with both arms, and held on. That is what sanctuary meant. It was not a legal fiction. To lay hands on the image of a god was to place yourself under that god's direct protection, and the entire ancient world understood that whoever broke that protection had done something that would be paid for. Ajax came in, not the great Ajax who had been dead for some time by then, but the other one, Ajax the son of Oileus, the Locrian, a fast and violent man who had been at Troy for 10 years and had lost whatever restraint he had ever possessed. He crossed the floor of the temple, and he took hold of Cassandra, and he pulled, and she would not let go, and so he pulled harder, and the image of the goddess came off its base and toppled with her. Some tellings say the statue turned its eyes away, others say it lifted from the ground. The image was made of wood and could not do either of those things, and yet the ancient sources insisted on it, and I think they insisted because they needed some way to say that the universe itself had recoiled. And there in the temple, in the sanctuary of the goddess whose image he had just knocked over, he raped her. She was a princess of Troy, a priestess, a suppliant, in a temple holding a sacred object. There is no single category of protection she was not covered by, and every one of them failed at once. Athena had spent 10 years as the most implacable enemy Troy had. She had guided the strategy, protected the champions, and helped design the horse. And in that moment, she changed sides so completely, and so finally that it would cost the Greek fleet more men than the last 5 years of the war. That is how bad it was. The goddess who had been working for their victory decided, on the night of their victory, that they were going to be punished for it. We will come back to what that punishment looked like. Elsewhere in the citadel, another old rule was being broken, and this one was more personal. Menelaus had spent 10 years and thousands of lives on one objective, and now he was inside the city with a sword, and he knew exactly which house he was going to. Deiphobus had married Helen after Paris died. Deiphobus was asleep and drunk in his own bed. The account of what happened in that house is short and brutal, and it includes a detail that has troubled readers for 3,000 years, which is that in one version Helen had already taken his weapons out of the room, and in another she was the one who stabbed him. Whatever the truth of it, Deiphobus died mutilated in his own bedchamber, and there is an image, later, in the tradition of his shade, encountered in the underworld, so disfigured that he is barely recognizable, still explaining what was done to him. And then Menelaus found Helen and did not kill her. There is a scene where Aeneas, moving through the burning city, catches sight of her hiding by a shrine and is seized with the desire to end it right there. She is the cause. She is the reason. Kill her, and at least something will have been balanced. And his mother, the goddess who protects him, stops his hand and tells him something he does not want to hear, which is that Helen is not the reason. Not really. The reason is, on Olympus, the reason is that the gods themselves decided this city would come down, and are at this moment tearing at its walls with their own hands. Whether that is a comfort, or the opposite is a question the story leaves open. Elsewhere, mercy happened, and it is worth recording because it is so rare in this account. There was an old Trojan counselor named Antenor who had argued for years, publicly and unpopularly, that Helen should be given back, and the war ended. Long before the war, he had received Menelaus and Odysseus in his own house, when they came as envoys, and there were Trojans who wanted to kill them on the spot, and he had protected them. On the night of the sack, that was remembered. His house was marked and spared. His family was spared. It is the only clean debt paid in the entire night. There was also, in that city, a very old woman named Aethra, who had been the mother of Theseus long ago and had been carried off to Troy as a servant, decades before, and who on that night found herself face to face with her own grandsons, grown men now, come with the army. They took her home. One family, out of all of them, was reunited that night, and it was a Greek one. And there was Laodice, one of Priam's daughters, of whom the tradition says something so strange and so merciful that I want to end this section on it. As the city fell, she prayed that the earth would open and take her, and the story says it did. The ground split, and she went down into it and was gone before anyone could put a hand on her. Out of all the women of that house, she is the only one who was answered. The rest were being gathered at that moment and driven down toward the shore. The flight of Aeneas. Aeneas came off the roof of Priam's palace, having watched the king die, and for a moment he was completely alone in the middle of a burning city, and he had no idea what to do. And then he thought about his father. Anchises was very old and could not walk. He was Aeneas's father by the Dardanian line. The branch of the royal house descended from Assaracus rather than Ilus, and he had been famous once, in his youth, for having been loved by a goddess. That was a long time ago. Now he was a frail old man in a house on the far side of a city that was coming apart. And with him were Creusa, Aeneas's wife, who was one of Priam's own daughters, and their small son Ascanius. Aeneas ran home. He found them alive, and he found his father absolutely refusing to leave. This is one of the truest scenes in the whole story, and anyone who has ever tried to move an elderly parent out of a house will recognize it instantly. Anchises would not go. He said he had lived long enough. He said he had already been struck once by the anger of the gods, and had been dragging out a half-life ever since. He said he could not face being carried out of his own city like baggage, to be an old man in exile in someone else's country. Go, he said. Take the boy. Leave me. I will die here, and someone will strip the body, and that is a small loss. And they argued, and he would not move, and Aeneas finally lost his temper in the particular way that people lose it when they are terrified, and reached for his weapons, and said fine. Then he would go back out and die in the street, because he was not going to be the man who walked out of Troy having left his father in it. And Creusa took hold of his feet. She held on to him, and she held their son up in front of him, and she said the thing that stopped him. If you are going out to die, then take us with you. But if you have any hope at all left in you, then look at this house first. Look at your father. Look at your son. Look at me. And then the house filled with light. On the top of Ascanius's head, in his hair, a small flame appeared. It moved across his scalp, and it did not burn him. His parents beat at it in terror and tried to put it out with water, and it went on burning gently, harmlessly, in a child's hair, in a doomed house. Anchises understood immediately. The old man got his hands up and asked for confirmation. One more sign, please, if this means what I think it means. And there was thunder on the left, and a star went over the roof of the house with a long trail of light, bright enough to read the street by, and went down toward the woods on the slopes of Mount Ida, with sparks falling behind it. That was enough. The old man said, "Now I will go. Now lead, and I will follow." So Aeneas knelt down. He put a cloak, or a lion's skin, in some accounts, over his shoulders, and he lifted his father onto his back. That image, a grown man carrying an old man on his shoulders out of a burning city, became one of the most reproduced images in the entire ancient world. There are hundreds of versions of it in bronze and clay and paint. It became a symbol of the single obligation that Romans centuries later would consider the foundation of every other virtue, which is that you do not put down the thing you are responsible for. Anchises carried the household gods, the small sacred images of the family, because Aeneas's hands were dirty with blood, and it would have been sacrilege for him to touch them. Ascanius held his father's right hand, and trotted alongside, taking 2 steps for every one of the adults, which the account notes with terrible tenderness. And Creusa walked behind. They agreed a meeting place, in case they were separated. Outside the walls, at an old temple of the harvest goddess, beside a cypress tree that the family had kept for generations. Then they went out into the streets, and the account of that walk is one of the most frightening passages in the literature of the ancient world, because it is written entirely from the point of view of a man who is carrying his father and cannot fight, cannot run properly, cannot look behind him, and cannot see. Every noise terrifies him. Every breath of wind terrifies him. He who had walked into massed spears without flinching an hour earlier is now afraid of everything, because he is holding 2 lives that are not his. They nearly made it out clean. They were almost at the gate, and then there was a noise of running feet, And Anchises shouted from his son's shoulders that they were coming, that he could see shields and firelight. And Aeneas panicked and left the roads and went off through side streets and alleys in the dark. And when he came out at the meeting place and set his father down and counted, Creusa was not there. She was simply gone. He never knew when. That is the detail that makes it unbearable. He did not see her fall. He did not hear her call out. Somewhere between the palace and the cypress tree, in the dark, in a street he could not name, his wife had stopped following, and he had not noticed because he had been listening for footsteps behind him, and had heard footsteps behind him, and had assumed they were hers. He went back in, he put his armor back on, and he went back into a city that was now entirely in Greek hands, and he retraced every step. He went back to the house, which was on fire. He went back to the palace, where he says the plunder was being stacked in the empty colonnades, and the captured women and children were already standing in long lines, waiting to be counted. He went through the streets, shouting her name, over and over, calling her name in the dark of a burning city, which is a thing so pointless and so completely human that it hurts to read. And then she came to him. She was taller than she had been. That is how the shade of a person is described. She stood in front of him and told him to stop, and stop grieving, because none of this had happened without the gods deciding it, and it was not permitted that she should come with him. She told him what was ahead, that there was a long exile and a great sea, and a country in the west with a river running through good soil, and that a kingdom and a new marriage were waiting for him there. And then she told him the only thing she actually wanted, which was that he should love their son. He tried to hold her. 3 times he put his arms around her neck, and 3 times what he was holding went through his hands, like wind, like a dream that comes apart when you wake. Then she was gone, and he went back out to the meeting place, and found that while he had been away, something had happened. The place was full of people. They had been coming all night, out of the smoke in 1s and 2s and families. Everyone who had managed to get out of Troy alive had made their way to the same old temple beside the cypress. Mothers with children, men who had lost everyone, the very old. They had gathered there in the dark, with nothing, and they were waiting, the account says, waiting for whoever showed up, ready to follow whoever would lead them wherever he was going. That is what was left of the Trojan people. A crowd in a field at dawn, and Aeneas picked up his father again, and turned his back on the light of the burning city, and led them up toward the mountains. The morning after, the sun came up on a plain that had a city on it the day before. Troy was still burning, and would burn for a long time, because a city that size does not go out quickly. The smoke went up in a single enormous column, and then flattened and spread when it hit the wind, and lay out over the water in a long grey smear that could be seen from a very great distance, which meant that for days afterward, everyone on that coast knew. And down on the shore, on the same beach where the Greek camp had stood for 10 years, the survivors were sitting in the sand waiting to be divided. This is the part of the story that the ancient world returned to more often than any other, and it is worth asking why. There were hundreds of years of Greek literature about the Trojan War, and the single most performed, most reproduced, most agonized over portion of it is not the fighting. It is this, a group of women sitting on a beach in the morning, after everything, waiting to find out who owns them. They were queens, some of them. They had been queens the previous afternoon. Hecuba was there. She had been the queen of the wealthiest city on that coast, the mother of 50 sons, and she was now an old woman sitting on sand, and she had watched her husband die on an altar a few hours earlier and had not been able to bury him. Andromache was there, with Astyanax in her arms. Cassandra was there. Polyxena, the wives of the princes, the daughters and granddaughters, and every woman of that enormous household, and behind them, the ordinary women of Troy in their thousands, and behind them the plunder in stacks, the bronze and the cloth and the cups and the furniture, and everything else that a rich city contains, being counted by clerks. The allotment was done by lot, and the results were, in every case, a specific and personalized cruelty. Cassandra went to Agamemnon, the commander of the army that had destroyed her city. Andromache, the widow of Hector, went to Neoptolemus, the son of the man who had killed Hector, and who had personally killed Priam a few hours before. Hecuba went to Odysseus, the man whose planning had brought the whole thing down, and there is a version of the tradition in which she cursed him so viciously and so publicly on that beach that the Greeks had to consider what to do about her. Andromache said something on that shore that has never stopped being quoted, and it goes roughly like this. She said that she envied her sister-in-law Polyxena, who had already been killed, because the dead do not have to go on being anything, and that if you compare not existing at all to living badly, not existing is easier, because at least it does not hurt. Hecuba told her she was wrong. Hecuba said, "While there is life, there is hope, and you have a son, and if any of Hector's blood survives, then someday there could be a Troy again." She should not have said it out loud. The herald came up the beach. His name was Talthybius, and he was the man whose job it was, for the whole war, to deliver the decisions of the Greek command, and the tradition treats him with a kind of exhausted sympathy, because he clearly hated this. He came up to Andromache, and he had to make himself say it, and he apologized before he did, which is somehow worse. The child could not be allowed to live. The reasoning had been given by Odysseus, and it was not passionate, it was administrative. It was the observation that the son of the best man Troy ever produced would grow up and would know exactly what had been done to his family, and that in 15 or 20 years there would be a young man somewhere with a claim and a grievance, and the blood of Hector in him. It is not wise, the argument went, to raise the cub of a lion. So they took him from her. The account of it does not spare anyone. Andromache holding him. Talthybius saying, "Please, do not make me take him by force, because if you fight this, they will not let you bury him afterward, and that is the one thing I can still get for you." Her understanding that this was true, and that the only power she had left in the world was the power to secure a grave for a body she had not yet lost. She gave him up. She spoke to him first, and what she said was the ordinary things any mother says, which is what makes it unendurable, that he had been born to be a lord of a city, that his little hands were like his father's, that she had raised him for nothing. They carried him up to the wall. Some accounts say Odysseus did it. Others say Neoptolemus. The oldest summaries disagree, and I am not going to pretend they agree. They threw him from the battlements of Troy, from the same walls his father had defended for 10 years. From the walls his name had been made out of, because Astyanax was a title before it was a name, and it meant lord of the city, and the city was gone, and so was he. And then, because the ships had already begun to load, and Andromache had already been taken aboard, it fell to his grandmother to prepare the body. They brought him back to Hecuba on the beach, and they brought him back on Hector's shield, because there was nothing else, and because a Greek herald had thought of it, which is a small terrible mercy. The great bronze shield that Hector had carried, that had been leaned against the wall in the palace, that had been the most famous object in Troy, used as a bier for a child small enough to fit inside it. Hecuba washed him. She talked to him while she did it. She said the thing that grandmothers say, which is that this was the wrong order, that she should have been the one being buried, and he should have been the one doing it, with his hair cut short in mourning, at the proper age, in his own country, with people watching. She put such grave goods on him as she could find in the wreckage of a sacked city, which was almost nothing, and then they buried him at the foot of the walls, in the ashes. There was one more. Polyxena was one of Priam's daughters, and the Greek fleet could not sail. The winds would not come, and eventually the reason became clear, or was said to be clear. The ghost of Achilles had appeared over his own burial mound and had demanded a share of the spoils, as was his right, and the share he wanted was a girl. So they took her up to the mound. Her mother tried to stop it, and could not, and the account of her death is the one detail in this whole grim sequence that the ancient world seems to have found genuinely moving. Because she did not beg. She told them not to hold her. She said she was the daughter of a king, and she would not be dragged to it like a slave. And she pulled her own robe open, and told the son of Achilles where to strike, and stood still, and let him. They cut her throat on the tomb of the man who had killed her brother. And the winds came back, and the fleet made ready to sail. That is what remained of the royal house of Troy on that beach. An old woman washing a dead child. A young widow already in a ship, a prophetess in the tent of the man who had led the war, and a girl's blood soaking into the top of a mound of earth on the shore. The scattering and the end of an age. And then they went, and Troy was over. The ships came off that beach in a long line and pulled out into the strait, and behind them the smoke stood up over the ruins, and every person on those ships was going somewhere. The Trojans were going too, in the holds, in the bottom of somebody else's boat, and the story of what happened to them afterward is not one story, it is a scattering. Follow them out, because they deserve to be followed. Hecuba went north with the fleet, and the fleet touched at the Thracian coast, and there the last of her sons was waiting for her, and he was dead. Polydorus had been the youngest. Priam had sent him away before the worst of the war, with a great deal of gold, to be fostered by a Thracian king, who was an old family friend, on the reasoning that if everything went wrong, at least one son would survive somewhere with the means to start again. It was a good plan. It was the plan of a man who had already lost too much to trust the future. The Thracian king killed the boy as soon as he heard Troy had fallen, and took the gold and threw the body into the sea. And when the Greek ships stopped on that coast, the tide brought him in, and Hecuba found him on the shingle. What she did about it is one of the most disturbing sequences in Greek tragedy, and it is the reason her name became a byword for grief that goes past grief and turns into something else. She lured the Thracian king into a tent with his 2 young sons on the promise of more Trojan gold. And there, with the other captive women, she killed the children in front of him and then took his eyes out with her hands. And afterward, the story says she was changed. Some versions say the gods transformed her into a black dog with burning eyes and she went howling along the shore of the strait. Others say she threw herself into the sea. Others, more quietly, say that she simply died there, and that the headland where she was buried was known ever after as the Dog's Monument, and that sailors used it as a landmark for centuries. There is even a strand, preserved by an old traveller who collected local traditions, that says Apollo took her away before any of it, and that she was never a slave at all. I want to be honest, that these are variants and the tradition never settled, but every single version ends with the same fact, which is that the Queen of Troy did not go home because there was no home, and did not stay a queen, and did not stay entirely herself. Cassandra went to Mycenae with Agamemnon, and knew exactly what was waiting. She told him. Of course she told him. She stood on the threshold of his palace and described his wife's plans in detail, and described her own death alongside his, and told him it would happen within the hour, and he took her inside anyway. Because nobody believed Cassandra, and that had never once stopped being true. She was killed in that house on her first night in Greece by a woman who had her own decade of reasons. And here is the strange, cold justice of it. Every single one of her prophecies had come true, and the last one came true too, and she had known that it would, and she walked in anyway. There is a line in one of the old plays where she says something like this, before she goes in, that human affairs are a drawing in the sand, and that a wet sponge wipes them out. She had spent her life being the only person who could see, and she had learned that seeing changes nothing at all. Andromache went to a kingdom in the northwest of Greece as the slave of Neoptolemus, and bore him children, and after he was murdered at Delphi, she was passed to Helenus, her husband's brother, the seer who had walked out of Troy in a temper and helped bring it down. And the 2 of them, the widow and the traitor, both of them Trojan, both of them survivors of the same night, ended up ruling a small kingdom together in a foreign country. And they built a Troy there, a small one, a miniature, a river they called by the old river's name, and a citadel they named after the old citadel, and a gate they called the Scaean Gate, and a false grave for Hector with no one in it. There is a moment in the later tradition where a wandering Trojan comes upon this place by accident and finds Andromache making an offering at that empty tomb, and it is one of the saddest things in all of ancient literature, because what she has built is not a city, it is a diorama of grief. And Helen went home. That has to be said, because from the Trojan side, it is the single most galling fact in the entire aftermath. Every argument about blame in that city for 10 years had circled around one woman, and when it was finished, she was the only person in the story who got back exactly what she had before. She sailed to Sparta. She was queen there again. There is a scene in the later tradition where a young man visits that palace years afterward and finds her presiding over a comfortable evening. Gracious and beautiful and entirely at ease, handing out gifts, mentioning Troy the way people mention a difficult period. The Trojan women hated her, and the old plays let them say so at length. In one of them, Hecuba stands in front of Menelaus and argues, point by point, that Helen should die, and Helen argues back that none of it was her doing, that a goddess had arranged it, that she had been a prize in a competition she never entered, that she had tried to get out of the city and been stopped. Hecuba tears the argument apart. Menelaus agrees with Hecuba, and then he takes Helen onto a ship anyway, and everyone watching knew he would, because everyone watching knew how the story ends. Whether she was a victim of the gods or the most successful survivor in Greek myth is a question the ancient world never resolved, and clearly enjoyed not resolving. What is not in question is the arithmetic. A city was destroyed, tens of thousands died, an entire royal family was killed or enslaved, and the woman at the center of it went back to her house. Antenor and the Trojans who were spared, stayed, and buried the dead, and built one enormous common pyre for everyone, because there were too many to do it properly. In some traditions he sailed west and founded a settlement on the northern Adriatic, and a great many cities around the Mediterranean would eventually claim, with varying degrees of credibility, that they had been founded by refugees from that night. That is what happens to a diaspora. It becomes a story that other people want to be part of. And Aeneas went west with his father on his shoulders, and his son by the hand, and 20 ships built out of the timber of Mount Ida. Anchises died on the way. Creusa was already gone. But the boy lived, and the household gods that the old man carried out of the burning house lived, and centuries later, a people on the far side of the sea would look back at that night and say, that is where we come from. We are the ones who did not die in Troy. There is something almost defiant in that. Rome would eventually build an entire national identity out of being descended from the losing side, not from the clever Greeks with the horse, from the people in the burning houses. As for the winners, Athena did not forget the temple. The fleet that sailed out of that bay in triumph was broken to pieces on the way home. Storms scattered it across the whole eastern sea. Ajax, the one who had dragged Cassandra from the altar, was wrecked on a rock, and there is a story that he survived the wreck, and clung on, and shouted that he had escaped in spite of the gods, and that the sea god heard him say it and split the rock under his hands, and let him go down. His own people were said to have paid for it for 1,000 years afterward, sending 2 girls every year to serve in Athena's temple on that coast, as a debt that never came clean. Agamemnon was murdered in his bath, on the night he got home. Odysseus took 10 years to cover a journey of a few weeks, and arrived alone, having lost every man he sailed with. Neoptolemus was killed at Delphi. Menelaus wandered for years before he saw Sparta again. Diomedes never went home at all. There is no version of the Trojan War in which the Greeks are simply victorious. Their own poets would not let them have that. The whole tradition is arranged so that the sack of Troy is the high point of Greek power, and the exact beginning of its unraveling, and the thing that turns one into the other is the night they spent breaking every rule they had. And Troy itself, the ruins stood there on the rise above the plain, and grass came up through them, and the wind off the water did what wind does. People lived there again, eventually, because the position was too good to leave empty, and travellers came for centuries afterward to look at a hill and be told which mound was whose. Conquerors made pilgrimages there. Poets wrote about it in languages that did not exist when it fell. But the thing that ended that night was bigger than a city, and the ancient world understood that. The generation that fought at Troy was the last generation of the heroes. Before it, there were men who wrestled monsters and sailed to the edge of the world, and had gods for parents. After it, there was ordinary history. Something closed. The gods stopped walking down onto the plain to argue with people. The bronze went into the ground. Whatever age that was, it was over, and everyone who wrote about it afterward was writing about something they knew they had missed. That is why we still tell it. Not because of the horse, and not because of the trick. We tell it because it is the oldest story we have about the specific way the world feels when something enormous ends, and about the people who were standing in it when it did. So think of them one more time before you sleep. Not the ruins, the afternoon before. The gates opened for the first time in 10 years. The whole city out on the plain in the sun, walking on grass they had not been allowed to walk on since the children were born. Somebody's arms around somebody, flowers being thrown, an old king coming down the road with a crowd around him. Still alive, still a king, believing that he had lived long enough to see the end of the worst thing that ever happened to his people. They were happy. That is the thing to hold on to. On the last afternoon of Troy, they were happy, and they had every reason to be, and nothing they did with that hope was foolish or wrong. The lamps are going out along the wall now. The plain is dark, and the sea beyond it is dark, and somewhere out past the headland there are ships waiting, that nobody can see. Let them be, just for tonight. Let the city stand a little longer. Good night.